Miss Marple investigates a lonely tea house where a mysterious visitor arrives after closing hours. What seems like an innocent meeting masks a secret of blackmail, betrayal, and a sudden disappearance. With her sharp eye, she must uncover who the visitor truly was before the crime vanishes into silence. Chapter 1. The Visitor at the Empty Tea House. It was the kind of afternoon that made one grateful to be English. Drowsy sunshine filtered through pale clouds, and the village of Little Skelton basked in a mood of quiet contentment. Bees droned around rose bushes. A dog barked in the far distance, and somewhere, faintly, the clink of teacups could be heard from the garden of Mrs. Hargreaves' thatched cottage. Miss Marple, settled comfortably in her drawing-room armchair, glanced over her knitting at the clock. 3:42. A bit early for tea, but then the rhythm of village life often bent to the weather. Outside her window, the gravel path that wound past the church and down toward Old Teahouse Lane lay still and untroubled. Yet something, perhaps no more than a subtle intuition sharpened by age and long observation, caused Miss Marple to pause in her stitching and peer more closely through the lace curtain. The old tea house had stood empty for 7 years, once the pride of the village, its ivy-covered windows and honeyed stone walls promising the best sponge cakes in 3 counties. It had shuttered suddenly when Mrs. Cotterill, the proprietress, had fallen ill and passed within a week. There had been talk, of course. There always was. But no one had come to claim the property, and it had stood vacant since. Its garden gone to thistle, and the signboard faded to a ghost of its former cheer. That made it all the more peculiar when a tall, spare man in a camel-colored overcoat and wide-brimmed hat turned down the lane and stopped before the gate. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She recognized nearly every soul in Little Skelton, and could place even the rare tourist by type. This man did not match any of the village's usual visitors, not a rambler, nor a writer, nor a distant cousin paying tribute to a family grave. No, there was something deliberate in his manner, something that suggested purpose. He removed a key from his coat pocket, glanced once over his shoulder, and let himself into the tea-house garden. Miss Marple let the curtain drop and resumed knitting. Not hurriedly, of course. That would have been too obvious, but with just enough added rhythm to suggest she was making excellent progress. On her nephew Edward's winter socks. By evening, the village had already taken note. "Oh yes, saw him myself," said Mrs. Blount, the baker's wife, to a gathering at the grocer's. Not a smile nor a word for anyone. Just marched in like he owned the place, which he might, for all we know. "I heard he brought furniture with him," added young Alice Weatherby, eyes wide. "There was a van parked at the bottom of the lane. Mr. Henley said it came from some estate in Oxfordshire." "Well, it's high time something was done with that tea-house," grunted Mr. Simmons, the retired constable. "Rotting into the ground." It was, but gossip turned to unease the next morning when Mrs. Martingale's dog, a yappy little terrier named Buttons, was found whining and scratching at the tea-house gate. The gate was locked, the windows still shuttered, but Buttons had a keen nose, and his refusal to be dragged away set tongues wagging. "Perhaps he smelled a rat," joked Reverend Biddle, trying for levity. But the humor fell flat. Miss Marple, for her part, made a point of walking the long way to the grocer's that afternoon, which happened to pass Old Teahouse Lane. She walked slowly, her blue eyes taking in the subtle signs, the rust on the hinges disturbed by recent movement, faint indentations on the gravel that suggested pacing, and a cracked pane in one of the front windows fresh. If her sense of decay served her right, there was no sign of the visitor. 2 days passed, then 3. The van was gone, and then, one Monday morning, Mr. Henley, who doubled as the village postman, reported something that turned the quiet hum of curiosity into a sharper note of alarm. "I delivered a parcel well. Tried to," he said, mopping his brow at the Grey Robin pub that evening. Left it at the Teahouse gate, as instructed. Next morning it was still there. Thought that odd, so I knocked, no reply. But when I peered through the gap in the curtain, I saw something. What sort of something? Prompted Mrs. Blount breathlessly. Henley hesitated. A hand, just barely, on the floor, not moving. That night, Sergeant Braithwaite arrived from the nearby market town. The Teahouse door was forced open with some reluctance and considerable ceremony. The man in the camel coat was found lying in the parlor, stiff and cold. He had fallen beside the hearth rug, one arm stretched outward as if reaching for something. A simple heart attack, some said. He looked the type, pale, anxious, the kind of man who brooded too much and slept too little. But others weren't so sure. No identification, Sergeant Braithwaite muttered, squinting at the sparse contents of the man's satchel. No wallet, no letters, nothing but this. He held up a tattered, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman in Edwardian dress, her features blurred by age and time. Miss Marple asked to see the photograph. The sergeant hesitated, then handed it over. She examined it silently, her expression unchanged. But a flicker, just the faintest shift in her eyes, might have suggested recognition. By Wednesday, the village was fully engulfed in the mystery. Who was the man? Why had he come? And why had he died with such a look? Yes, the vicar's wife insisted she'd seen it of sorrow on his face. The coroner's report was brief and unsatisfactory. No signs of violence, no apparent poison, simply a death of the natural sort, if oddly timed. But Miss Marple, who had known far too many supposedly natural deaths to be reassured by tidy answers, sat very still that evening as she sipped her tea. She watched the rain begin to fall gently against the window pane, and murmured to no one in particular. People seldom return to a place of sadness unless they are seeking something, or someone, and with that, she reached for her notebook, a small, battered thing with a rosebud on the cover, and made a single note beneath the date. Teahouse visitor, photograph of woman, no luggage. Look again at Cotterell history. The evening wore on, and the village quieted beneath the drizzle. But something had shifted. The peace of Little Skelton had been disturbed, and in the silence left behind by the man's death, questions were beginning to gather like mist across the village green. Chapter 2. A photograph, a teacup, and a widow's memory. The morning after the discovery of the dead man in the Teahouse, the village of Little Skelton buzzed with speculation, disguised as concern. A death always shook the rhythm of things, especially a stranger's death. In a place where every face was familiar, and every secret carefully tended beneath smiles, an unknown visitor dying in the midst of it all was as unsettling as an open door. In the dead of night, at the High Street grocer's, Miss Fallow, the church organist, whispered to Mrs. Everdene about the teacup found shattered near the hearth. They say he dropped it in his final moments. Just fell forward, the poor soul. Heart giving out like a candle blown out in a breeze, or like someone snuffed it. Mrs. Everdene replied grimly, eyeing the apple she had been inspecting as though suspecting foul play in its sheen. Miss Marple, who had paused at the far shelf to compare tins of marmalade, made no comment. She had already heard from Sergeant Braithwaite that the man's cause of death was officially heart failure, but she also knew, quite precisely, the way a man looked when death came expected and the way it looked when it arrived too soon. She returned home by way of the churchyard, taking her time. Her thoughts were preoccupied with three details that, though unconnected on the surface, had begun to tangle into something more. First, the photograph worn, deliberately kept, perhaps even cherished. Second, the lack of luggage. Even the most haphazard of visitors brought a suitcase or a grip. And third, the man's silence. Not one villager recalled speaking with him. People rarely vanish in life without effort. And when they do, Miss Marple had learned, they usually have a reason rooted in shame, danger, or guilt. Upon reaching her cottage, She made herself a modest breakfast, seated primly at her small round table set with blue and white china. Her mind wandered to the Cotterill family, the last known occupants of the old tea house. It had always seemed curious to her how swiftly Mrs. Cotterill had passed, and how her only child, a daughter named Lillian, had disappeared from village view soon after the funeral. No obituary, no wedding announcement, no mention even in the Women's Institute. Just gone. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a call upon Mrs. Emmeline Haydock, the widow who lived in the ivy-smothered cottage to doors. Down from the old vicarage, Mrs. Haydock had a memory as sharp as a pin and a fondness for brandy in her afternoon tea, an indulgence that often brought forth delightful lapses in discretion. "My dear Jane, how kind of you to visit. Do sit-o, careful with the cushion. The cat's claws have had their way with it." Miss Marple smiled warmly and settled into the offered chair. "I thought I might call on you for a little recollection. You knew Mrs. Cotterill rather well, didn't you?" "Oh, I suppose I did. Rather too proud for her own good, but she made a delightful cherry scone. And her little garden behind the tea-house roses the size of cabbages." "What made you think of her?" "The recent incident," Miss Marple said delicately. "It reminded me of the last time the tea-house caused a stir." Mrs. Haydock's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, you mean when poor Mrs. Cotterill died so suddenly?" "Yes, yes. Quite the scandal, though no one said as much aloud. Heart gave out, or so the doctor claimed, but she'd always been in perfect health. And then there was that business with Lillian." Miss Marple folded her hands, waiting. "She ran off. You know, not the usual sort of running off, either. One morning she was seen buying stamps, and the next gone. No farewell, no forwarding address. Just a note, if you could call it that. Scribbled, barely legible. Said she was going north, that's all. Did anyone try to find her?" "Oh, the vicar made an inquiry or two, but there was no husband to follow up. And Mrs. Cotterill's brother, some awful man from Tunbridge Wells, refused to pay for any private investigation. If she wants to be lost, he said, let her stay lost. Dreadful man." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And has anyone heard of her since?" "Not a whisper. And you know how this village clings to a whisper." They sipped tea in silence for a moment before Miss Marple changed tack. "Mrs. Haydock, do you recall anyone unusual visiting the Cotterill tea house in its final weeks?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Haydock said promptly, setting down her teacup with a delicate clink. "I remember a gentleman, tall, very neat, always wore gloves, even in July, had a sad sort of face. Not unpleasant, but hollow, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple's eyes twitched at the corners. "Was he local?" "Oh no. Spoke with a slight accent. Not quite French, more Central European. A professor, perhaps. Came twice. Once alone, once with Lillian. I remember thinking she looked afraid. Afraid? Or uncertain. Her eyes darted around the room like she was expecting someone to interrupt them. And after that second visit, I never saw her again." Miss Marple thanked her and left, a small chill brushing her spine despite the warmth of the day. The past was a stubborn thing in Little Skelton. It sank into stone, into hedgerows and hearth smoke. It never truly vanished, only grew quiet, waiting to be disturbed. That evening, she returned to the photograph. She held it beneath her reading lamp and inspected the faded edges. The young woman's dress was of an earlier era, Edwardian perhaps, but it was the necklace that struck Miss Marple as familiar, a cameo pendant, with a curling leaf pattern, the kind one might pass down through generations. She opened her second desk drawer and retrieved an old scrapbook of village fêtes and garden parties. In a photograph from 1923, a girl stood beside a maypole, clutching a ribbon and smiling shyly. Around her neck a nearly identical pendant. The girl was Lillian Cotterill. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, and made another note in her rosebud-covered notebook. Cameo, stranger's accent. Gloves in July. Teahouse connection confirmed. She closed the book gently. Something unspoken had indeed returned to Little Skelton. A story left unfinished, a thread plucked taut across years of silence. And the death in the teahouse, so easily dismissed, was no beginning, it was a continuation. Somewhere in the village, someone still remembered more than they let on. And Miss Marple, with her knitting in hand and her eyes quietly observing, intended to find them. Chapter 3. The postcard from Zurich the next morning dawned misty, with a softness in the air that seemed to hush even the birds. Miss Marple, rising earlier than usual, spent a quiet hour trimming her sweet peas and deadheading the asters. Gardening had always been, for her, both a comfort and a form of meditation. Thoughts fell into line more easily when one's hands were occupied, and the air smelt faintly of damp earth and memory. She had just returned to the cottage when the post arrived. 3 letters, a flyer from the Women's Institute, and a postcard with a foreign stamp. Miss Marple turned it over, curiosity flaring. It was addressed to Miss C. L. Cotterill, Old Teahouse, Little Skelton, Berkshire. The postmark read Zurich, Switzerland, dated 5 days prior. Miss Marple studied the handwriting. It was firm, angular, and continental Germanic, she guessed, though not native German. The message was brief. The roses were not as you described. Still, I looked. You were right not to return. I trust the balance will be settled now. If there was no return address, no surname, only the cryptic initial. But something about the phrasing unsettled her. You were right not to return, as though Lillian had considered doing so, and then changed her mind, or had been warned away. Tucking the postcard into her notebook, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Biddle, a lean, earnest man with slightly startled eyes, was in his study arranging hymn sheets when she arrived. "Ah, Miss Marple, you've caught me in the act of Sunday preparation," he said with a smile. Dusting off his cassock, "I do apologize for intruding, but I wondered if your memory might assist me with a small matter." She replied gently, "Certainly. Anything I can do. Do you recall performing the funeral rites for Mrs. Cotterill?" The vicar blinked, visibly surprised. "Goodness, yes, quite vividly. In fact, a rather sudden affair. She had no church attendance record, but she was, by all accounts, decent and honest. And her daughter, Lillian, did she request anything unusual? A private blessing, perhaps?" He hesitated. "There was one thing. Lillian asked for the grave to be closed as quickly as possible. She seemed distressed by the burial. I assumed it was grief, but now that you mention it, there was a kind of urgency in her behavior. Did she speak of any visitors? Anyone from abroad?" "No, nothing like that, though I do recall a peculiar man attending the service. He stood at the edge of the cemetery, never came forward, just watched. Tall, thin, dark overcoat looked out of place. I remember thinking he might have been a distant relation." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he speak to anyone?" "Not to my knowledge. When I looked back at the end of the service, he was gone." "Thank you, Reverend. That is most helpful." As she stepped back into the lane, Miss Marple thought of the man now dead in the teahouse stall, spare, camel-colored coat. Could it have been the same figure from the funeral? If so, then his connection to Lillian or to her mother went back further than anyone had realized. She walked to the general store next. Mrs. Porter, who ran it with a brisk air and a deep respect for village hierarchy, greeted her with practiced cheer. "Miss Marple, your usual tea arrived yesterday. I put aside a tin, knowing how fussy you are about your blends. How thoughtful of you, dear. I'm also curious, do you recall whether anyone ever forwarded mail for Miss Lillian Cotterill?" Mrs. Porter frowned. "Oh yes, for a while. After she left, we received post now and again. Mostly foreign, France, Germany, once something from Buenos Aires, if you can believe it. We'd hold them for a week, and then a driver would come collect them. Always the same man. Never gave a name. A driver? From where? Black car. London plates. Very quiet fellow. Bit like a butler. Wouldn't meet your eyes. Did he sign for the letters? No, just nodded. It stopped about 2 years ago. Miss Marple pressed her lips together. A foreign correspondent. A secret forwarding system. A daughter who disappeared without warning. And now, a dead man in the very house where those memories lay dormant. Returning home. She placed the postcard in an envelope and penned a short note to Inspector Cray at county headquarters, requesting a trace on any recent arrivals from Zurich matching the man's description. She doubted they would find anything useful if this man had gone to such lengths to erase himself. He wouldn't have used his real name, but it was worth attempting. That evening, the quiet was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Braithwaite appeared at Miss Marple's door, his expression unreadable. Evening, Miss Marple. Hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Sergeant. Do come in, he said awkwardly in the armchair she offered, glancing around as though uncertain how much to reveal. I came because of the stranger's possessions, he began. They've been catalogued. Most unremarkable, except... He opened a folder and handed her a photograph. It was another image clearer than the one she'd seen before. This time, Lillian stood beside a man. Not the one now dead, but younger, with a sharp face and a mischievous tilt to his smile. It was in a hidden compartment in his satchel, Braithwaite said, folded behind the lining. There's an inscription on the back. Miss Marple turned it over. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were clear. L and O, Lausanne, 1938. No more secrets. Lausanne, she repeated quietly. You think this O could be the man we found? Perhaps. Or someone he lost. No more secrets, a promise made, and perhaps broken. Still no ID on him. Braithwaite said with a sigh. But we did receive a call this morning from the Swiss consulate. Seems someone matching his description visited the British embassy there 6 weeks ago, inquiring about death records for one Caroline Cotterill. That's the mother, isn't it? Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Indeed, but she died here. Why not simply request the record from the local office? Exactly. Unless, Miss Marple murmured, he didn't believe she died here, or suspected the truth was hidden. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the evening shadows deepened across the village green. Miss Marple offered the sergeant a final thought. Sometimes, Sergeant, people rewrite history not by lying but by omitting the part that most shames them. And shame, I find, is often at the root of murder. He left shortly after, more thoughtful than when he'd arrived. Alone, Miss Marple returned to her notebook. She wrote a single line beneath the day's entries: Zurich, Lausanne. Lillian vanished. Caroline perhaps didn't. Then she underlined the last 3 words. Chapter 4, Lillian's Mirror. The following day brought a curious shift in the weather. Though the skies remained gray and the clouds hung low, the air carried in odd warmth and seasonal for early October in Little Skelton. Miss Marple, who noticed such things more than most, remarked upon it aloud as she poured herself a second cup of tea. Murder, she murmured, tends to settle into a village like mist, quiet, persistent, and never quite noticed until you're soaked through. She had just finished making tidy notes on the latest revelation, the photograph from Lausanne, the Swiss consulate inquiry, when a knock sounded at the door. It was Alice Weatherby, the vicar's niece, breathless and wide-eyed. Miss Marple, I've just come from the Teahouse. Miss Marple set down her teacup with delicate precision. The Teahouse, my dear? I didn't go in well, not all the way. But I was walking Buttons past it, and the door was ajar. Only slightly, but definitely open. That's curious, Miss Marple replied, rising. I do believe it was secured when Sergeant Braithwaite left it. It was. I mean, it should have been. But it was open just now, and there was something inside. A light, I think, faint. Upstairs, Miss Marple took a shawl from the peg, tied it neatly beneath her chin, and followed Alice up the lane. The tea house stood as it had for years, quiet, slightly sunken, ivy creeping along its front wall. Yet today, a subtle difference stirred the air around it, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The door creaked slightly with the push of Miss Marple's gloved hand. She stepped inside, and the scent met her instantly, a musty mixture of disuse damp wood and something fainter, old lavender, perhaps, or perfume, long dried. "Stay on the step, Alice," Miss Marple instructed gently. The parlor was just as she remembered it. The overturned teacup still lay shattered by the hearth. The dead man's body had long since been taken away, but a faint indentation remained in the carpet, a darker patch, as if memory had left a mark. She moved to the stairs. The air grew warmer as she climbed. The second floor was dim, but not dark. Light seeped through a narrow crack in the door at the end of the corridor. She pushed it open. It was Lillian Cotterill's bedroom. Miss Marple remembered it vaguely from a village Christmas years ago, when the tea house had hosted a pudding raffle. The wallpaper was the same pale rose pattern. The vanity stood as it must have then aged, but carefully kept. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the mirror. It leaned against the wall, its glass clouded with dust, but not untouched. A single clean line had been swiped through its center, as if by a hand, and beneath it, on the vanity table, lay a photograph in a silver frame. Miss Marple leaned closer. It was the same image the sergeant had shown her, Lillian, and the smiling man in Lausanne. But this time there was a second picture tucked beside it, a small portrait, black and white, of Caroline Cotterill in her youth, her expression strangely guarded. Beside the photographs lay an envelope, unopened, with no stamp, to be opened only if I fail to return. Elsie. Miss Marple did not touch it. Downstairs, Alice called nervously. "Miss Marple." "In a moment, dear." She continued surveying the room. A small drawer in the vanity was partially open. Inside, a faded train ticket, punched twice, dated March 1939. Destination, Vienna. Miss Marple frowned. She replaced the drawer and turned to leave, but something near the wardrobe caught her eye. Scratches on the floorboards. Recent, by the look of them. She crouched carefully and ran a finger along the grooves. The wardrobe had been moved. She shifted it slightly and found, behind it, a small wooden panel, crudely fitted. With a tug, it came loose. Inside, a narrow recess lined with dust and paper. She pulled out the first bundle. Letters, dozens, all in the same angular hand as the postcard from Zurich. Some dated back nearly 20 years, others as recent as last spring. Each one began with a variation of the same phrase, "My dearest Lillian." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her breath caught faintly in her chest. She replaced the letters carefully and stepped out into the hall. When she returned downstairs, Alice was pacing nervously. "There was someone here," she said. "I swear it. I saw movement behind the curtain just for a second." Miss Marple followed her gaze. The parlor curtain swayed faintly, but the room was empty. Whoever had been there had slipped out again, quiet as a ghost. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Dr. Bertram Ailing, the village's soft-spoken general practitioner, whose memory for local medical records was second only to his fondness for chess. "I wonder, Dr. Ailing," she began, "if you recall the particulars of Mrs. Cotterill's death." He furrowed his brow. "Heart attack, as I recall. Sudden, no prior symptoms. Though I didn't attend the death myself, that was old Dr. Winston, before he retired." "And you never treated her daughter?" "Lillian, once or twice. Nervous disposition. Complained of dizzy spells, but there was nothing specific. She stopped coming shortly after her mother passed." "Do you believe Caroline Cotterill's death was typical?" Ailing shifted uncomfortably. "Well, now that you ask, No, it was very sudden, uncharacteristic. She'd come in for a checkup just 2 weeks before and was perfectly well. I remember Dr. Winston mentioned it seemed abrupt. Were there any inquiries made? None official. She wasn't the sort to raise alarms. And with Lillian disappearing soon after, well, people just assumed grief took its toll. Miss Marple left not long after, her thoughts circling. If Caroline had not died naturally, someone had arranged it to appear that way. And Lillian, whether by choice or coercion, had fled. She returned home as the first stars appeared. Pale and tremulous, in the stillness of her sitting room, she opened her notebook again. Letters hidden, envelope unread. Caroline's portrait kept beside the man from Lausanne. Why Vienna? She tapped her pen gently. F is not just correspondent. F was here, in the Teahouse, watched the funeral, and returned now, too late or too soon. Outside, the wind stirred the hedges. Somewhere in the village, someone else was thinking of the Teahouse, watching it, perhaps remembering the same photograph. And if Miss Marple's instincts were correct, and they usually were, that someone would soon make another move. Chapter 5. The Man from the Border. By midweek, Little Skelton had begun to fold the death of the stranger into its landscape, as it did with most disturbances. The Teahouse remained cordoned off by a length of limp twine and a sign that read police inquiry. Do not enter, though that hadn't stopped schoolboys from sneaking up to the window and daring one another to touch the latch. Even Buttons the terrier, now notoriously fixated on the Teahouse gate, had taken to sitting vigilantly beside it each morning like a woolly sentry. But for Miss Marple, the village's slow return to routine only intensified her sense of tension. Something was unresolved. A thread was missing, or rather, pulled just enough to unravel everything else. She had seen that before, in murders masked as accidents, in family squabbles that ended with someone quietly vanished. And now there was the matter of the Vienna train ticket. 1939, the year war unfurled across Europe. She had spent the evening reading through her old clippings and war memoirs, reminded of how many people had changed their names, disappeared, or begun again during those years, sometimes for love, often for survival. That morning, as she stepped into the post office for stamps, she noticed a man at the counter ahead of her. He was middle-aged, plainly dressed, and carried himself with the heavy carefulness of someone used to go unnoticed. But it was the slight limp, the kind one earned from an old injury, that Miss Marple recognized first. She had seen it once before, nearly 20 years ago, in the late autumn of 1946, when a Red Cross envoy passed through Chipping Cleghorn with refugee documents in his coat pocket. He turned, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He looked away quickly, thanked Mrs. Porter, and left. Miss Marple purchased her stamps, then stepped out and followed. Not obtrusively, of course. One learned long ago that the most effective following in a village came not from ducking behind hedges, but from simply appearing to be on one's natural path. The man crossed the green, paused near the war memorial, and then made his way unsurprisingly toward the old Teahouse lane. He did not enter the house. Instead, he passed by it slowly, gazing at the windows with something between grief and calculation. Then he continued on, disappearing around the corner toward Mill Lane. Miss Marple made her way home and set the kettle to boil. Within the hour, Sergeant Braithwaite arrived at her request, his notebook in hand and his brow already furrowed. "You're certain you saw him?" "I am," said Miss Marple mildly. "And what's more, I believe he is not new to the matter." She recounted her sighting, her suspicions, and the limp. Braithwaite tapped his pen thoughtfully. "Well, I'll ask around, see if anyone else has noticed a stranger lingering. Could be a relative of the deceased, though it seems unlikely he'd be so secretive about it." "People who carry secrets," said Miss Marple gently, "often do so because of shame, or danger, or love. This man, I believe, is attached to one of the three. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly at her writing desk, rereading the recovered postcard from Zurich. Her eyes lingered on one phrase. You were right not to return. It suggested fear, certainly, but also knowledge. Had Lillian known the visitor in the Teahouse would come looking for her? And if so, was he the danger or the one she had once loved? She opened the folded envelope marked to be opened only if I fail to return. Inside, one sheet of paper, no salutation, no date. Just a single paragraph in Lillian's fine, elegant script. If you are reading this, I am either dead or too afraid to return. My name is not truly Cotterill, nor was my mother truly Caroline. She carried that name from another life, one buried when the borders closed and the letters stopped. The man who may come looking is called Friedrich. He once saved us both, but he may also be the reason she died. Miss Marple set the letter down, the corners of her mouth drawn in thought. Friedrich. So F had a name now, and a history entangled with two women who had hidden their past so deeply. Not even the village had suspected it. The next morning, she visited the library in Market Cleave. Though its resources were modest, it held a small archive of wartime registries, including resettlements. With the help of a kind assistant, Miss Marple traced the name Caroline Cotterill back through the 1940 census. There, recorded on faded typewritten cards, was an entry from March 1939. Name, Carolina Feuerstein. Arrival port, Folkestone. Origin, Vienna. Accompanied by child female, aged 7. So Caroline Cotterill had been Carolina Feuerstein. And Lillian, not born in Little Skelton at all. Miss Marple copied the record and walked slowly back through the village. Her thoughts were grave. A refugee mother, a child raised in concealment, a man named Friedrich, possibly the father, possibly more. As she passed the vicarage, the vicar's niece, Alice, came hurrying down the path. Miss Marple. She called breathlessly. You won't believe it. There's been another break-in at the Teahouse. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Was anything taken? They say just one thing, Alice said. A box, wooden, small enough to carry. The police were there just now. Mr. Henley said he saw the man run off, but he couldn't catch him. Miss Marple said nothing, but a small, cold understanding began to form. Someone was trying to erase whatever remained of Carolina Feuerstein's past. That night, she made one more note in her notebook. Name change. Wartime escape. Friedrich equals F man from the border. Box gone. But mirror, letters, Vienna ticket remain. Motive growing clearer. Not inheritance. Not passion. Protection or revenge. She closed the notebook and looked out her window. The Teahouse lay in the distance, cloaked by ivy and moonlight. The dead man had come seeking answers. Someone else had come seeking silence, and between them, Lillian's truth still waited, reflected faintly in a dusty mirror, etched in train tickets and letters no one was meant to find. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Bought No Teat. Was Thursday when the second stranger came to Little Skelton. Unlike the man in the camel coat or the limping figure at the post office, this visitor did not move with secrecy or sorrow. She arrived by taxi, stepped out in an immaculate navy blue suit, and walked directly into the village grocer's as if she had lived there all her life. Mrs. Porter, startled into a rare silence, later described her as the sort of woman who says very little and makes you feel it's your fault. Miss Marple, who had come in just after to inquire about the latest parcel for the Women's Institute raffle, took one look at the stranger and immediately understood. This woman was not here for tea, or biscuits, or even village gossip. She was here for something else, something precise. The woman left with a tin of sardines and a bottle of tonic water, which she carried in a leather handbag far too fine for groceries. As she stepped past Miss Marple, her eyes flicked over her not unkindly, but with an assessing coolness. like a solicitor sizing up the terms of a will. Miss Marple watched her disappear down the lane and turned back to Mrs. Porter. "She's not local," she said mildly. "Not remotely," Mrs. Porter replied. "Didn't even ask for the daily milk. And do you know the strangest thing? She asked if the Teahouse was still for sale." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her shopping list. "For sale? Imagine. I told her it was under inquiry after that poor man's death, but she just nodded, said she was interested in the property, and asked if there'd been any recent tenants." "And did you tell her?" "I told her what I tell anyone I know nothing and say even less." Mrs. Porter sniffed proudly. "But I don't like her, Jane. She's too tidy, like someone pretending to be what she isn't." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out into the sunlight. The woman was already out of sight, but Miss Marple had a hunch as to where she would go next. She followed the lane until it curved near the churchyard wall, and there, just as she suspected, stood the woman, not at the Teahouse gate, but across from it, facing the building with the posture of someone inspecting a battlefield. Miss Marple approached quietly. "A great many memories live in that house," she said by way of greeting. The woman turned, not startled. Her face was angular, striking early 60s, perhaps, with elegant streaks of silver in her dark hair. She regarded Miss Marple with a kind of amused reserve. "I imagine they do," she replied. "But memories have a way of souring when they're left untended." Miss Marple smiled. "Quite. I always think of memory like cream that requires churning, or it spoils." The woman let out a short laugh. "You must be the village detective. I wouldn't dream of claiming such a title. But I have lived here long enough to see how people behave when they wish not to be seen." The woman looked back at the Teahouse. "I was told it was empty." It was. Then a visitor died. Then someone broke in. "Now you've come." There was a pause. Then, quietly, "I'm not here for him, you know. I'm here for her." Miss Marple's eyes did not shift. "Lillian." "No. Carolina." The name landed with the weight of something unburied. "You knew her." "I worked with her. In Vienna, before the war. I was only a girl then, not more than 15, but she was extraordinary. Sharp as glass. Beautiful, too, in a careful sort of way." Miss Marple let the woman speak without interruption. "She taught me to file papers, secret ones. She said, 'Information is power, child, and you're safer holding it than running from it.' When things went dark after the Anschluss, she vanished. I thought she was dead. Then, 20 years later, I saw her name on a list of possible informants, and I realized she had made it out." "Why come now?" Miss Marple asked. "Because someone else saw the same name, and that someone didn't believe she was innocent." Miss Marple thought of the man in the Teahouse, the letters, the erased history. "You believe he came for revenge?" "No, I believe he came for proof. Friedrich was many things, but not a killer. Not unless he had to be." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Then, would you come to tea?" The woman blinked. "You mean now?" "I've found that memory settles better with a scone." They sat in Miss Marple's cottage. The tea laid out precisely silver spoons, strawberry jam, the good cream. The woman, who introduced herself only as Eva Muller, stirred her cup with long, slow movements. "Carolina never betrayed anyone," she said eventually. "But there was a file, an accusation, that she had given up a list of names to the Gestapo. It was never proven, but the suspicion followed her. She changed her name, yes, and left behind everything, including perhaps Friedrich. I don't know if they were lovers or simply linked by fear, but I believe he spent years searching for her, and I think she knew he would." Miss Marple nodded. "She left a note, said that Friedrich once saved them, but also hinted he may have been the cause of her death." Ava's expression flickered. "That doesn't sound like him. People can change, or regret, or remember something differently." Eva stared into her cup. "He had a brother, Otto, more radical. more brutal. If anyone wanted Carolina dead, it would be him. But he died years ago, or so we thought. Miss Marple opened her notebook and showed Eva the photograph of the man found in the teahouse. Eva studied it carefully, lips pressed into a thin line. That's Friedrich. Older, thinner, but him. He must have found her, or thought he had. But why come here? Why now? To confirm whether the accusation was true, or to stop someone else from unearthing it. Eva looked up. You believe someone else is involved? I believe the past rarely comes alone. They sat in silence. Outside, the village clock chimed 5. I should go, Eva said at last, rising. But if you hear anything, if you find anything that speaks to Carolina's innocence, I'll see that it is not forgotten. Miss Marple said gently as Eva stepped out into the lane, her navy coat brushing against the hedgerow. Miss Marple watched her go with a deepening sense of unease. If Friedrich had come for truth, he had died before speaking it. And if Eva Muller had come for redemption, then someone else, still unseen, might have come for silence. Miss Marple picked up her pen and made a final note. Eva Muller. Carolina's past. File of names. Accusation Otto. A second visitor still in the village. The shadows had lengthened by the time she set down her cup. The mystery was no longer simply about a dead man in Teahouse. It was about the lie someone had buried and the person who might kill to keep it there. Chapter 7. The silence at Widow Hargrove's. The village clock rang in Friday with its usual sleepy chime. A current of unease hummed through Little Skelton, as if the hedgerows and chimney pots themselves were listening. The teahouse remained under its soft shroud of ivy and suspicion, but now the question stretched beyond it. Miss Marple sensed it in the way villagers paused mid-sentence when the topic turned to the recent visitor, in the way Mrs. Everdeen burned her scones, even in the way Reverend Biddle forgot the second verse of the harvest hymn. Fear had arrived, though none would call it that. Miss Marple, however, understood that fear often didn't announce itself with screaming or scandal. It arrived with silences, small ones, like the sudden hush in a room when someone walks in, or larger ones like the silence between lies. She was knitting by the window that morning when a knock came hesitant. Light. At the door stood the postman, Mr. Henley, cap askew, his mustache twitching with nerves. I thought you should know, Miss Marple. Widow Hargrove says someone's been in her garden shed. Miss Marple blinked. Her garden shed. Left footprints, he said. She says they weren't hers. And the latch was broken. Miss Marple took a moment to retrieve her shawl. Let's have a look, shall we? Widow Hargrove lived in a sloping cottage behind the village green, surrounded by geraniums, birdhouses, and memories. She greeted them with her usual flurry of hands and apologies, her eyes darting nervously toward the hedge. It was yesterday evening, she said, after the sun dipped. I went to fetch a spade and found the shed door open. I always latch it, always. Did you see anyone? Miss Marple asked. No, but I heard a cough. Not mine, deep, male, I think. Then a sound like a thump, and then nothing. They walked around to the shed. Miss Marple crouched and studied the disturbed earth outside the door. One footprint had held its shape in the soft mud. A man's, heavy-soled, possibly a boot. Nearby, she noticed something half buried under a leaf. She picked it up, a matchbox. Foreign branding, with Zündholzfabrik printed across it. German or Austrian. She pocketed it and turned to Widow Hargrove. Have you noticed anything missing? Well, the woman hesitated, rubbing her hands together. There was a trunk in the corner. My father's. I'd kept old files in it. Letters from the war. A few things Carolina gave me. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. You were close. We weren't friends, not as such. But once, long ago, she asked me to keep a parcel. I never opened it. She collected it a year later, thanked me, and never spoke of it again. But after that, We shared nods. Quiet understanding. Did she ever mention a man named Otto? Widow Hargreaves' face changed. Once, briefly, she said it like one says a name that tastes bitter. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the widow's arm. Would you mind if I had a closer look in the shed? Of course, dear. Inside, dust swirled in beams of light from the cracked window. Gardening tools hung in crooked lines. The corner where the trunk had stood was empty, but marked by scuffed floorboards, and a faint smell old paper. Perhaps, or something older still. Miss Marple touched the wall. There, tucked behind a beam, was a fragment of a torn envelope. Only a corner, but she could make out the letterhead. Allied Records Office, London. Someone had been searching for proof. She stepped out into the sunlight and found Mr. Henley still chatting with the widow. She thanked them both and made her way back through the village, stopping only once at the library's notice board. A fresh flyer had been posted. Room to let, quiet tenant preferred. Nitrogen monoxide pets. Inquire at old coach house. Mill Lane. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but it was the same ink used to amend the Teahouse sale notice the week before. She walked briskly to Mill Lane. The old coach house was tucked between hedgerows, almost forgotten. A modest building with crooked shutters and moss on the tiles. Miss Marple knocked once, no answer. She waited, then knocked again. From inside, a sound movement, barely more than a creak, but no footsteps followed. She turned and left. That evening, the wind picked up. Branches tapped against her windows like cautious fingers. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, matchbox in hand, the torn envelope beside her teacup. She had seen too many murders where the motive was money or jealousy, but this was about identity, about a name erased and replaced. And now, someone wanted that name unerased. She opened her notebook and wrote, Hargreaves shed. Trunk gone. Matchbox equals Zurich or Vienna. Otto more feared than Friedrich. Is Otto alive? Did Friedrich find Carolina to Lator just in time? There was a knock at the door. Miss Marple rose slowly. At the threshold stood Sergeant Braithwaite, his expression tight. Sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple. We've received a call from the post office in Cleve. A man came in asking for any remaining mail for Elsie Cotterill. Said he was her nephew. Left a false address. Mrs. Porter rang us the moment he walked out. Miss Marple nodded. Did she describe him? She did. Austrian accent, limp, graying hair. Looked familiar. Friedrich? I think so. Or someone close enough to pass as him. Miss Marple's fingers curled around the edge of her armchair. He's not finished yet, she said softly. Not if he came back for the letters. Do you believe he's dangerous? Miss Marple hesitated. I believe he's afraid. And fear, she said, is the most dangerous emotion of all, especially when someone is willing to rewrite history to survive it. She looked again at the torn envelope. The past had not merely returned to Little Skelton. It was circling. Waiting. And this time, it would not go quietly. Chapter 8. The photograph that wasn't there. Saturday morning broke damp and pale. A light drizzle veiled the windows of Little Skelton, softening edges and muting color. The church bell chimed once low, unsure before falling back into silence. It was the sort of morning when the village seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, wrapped in her cardigan, her knitting untouched on her lap. The letter fragment from the Allied Records Office lay before her, alongside the matchbox from Zurich and the scuffed corner of a photograph she hadn't meant to find. She had opened the frame from Lillian's vanity the night before and discovered that behind the smiling image of Lillian and Friedrich, there was once another torn out so precisely that only a faded triangle of backing remained. Someone had removed it recently. And that was the puzzle now haunting her. What did the missing photograph show? She knew the answer was buried in the same place as every secret in Little Skelton. Not in the Teahouse or the official records, but in the minds of those who remembered and never spoke, which meant it was time to visit Mr. Trowbridge. Thomas Trowbridge had once been the village solicitor, a sharp-eyed man with a fondness for ink-stained waistcoats and an iron filing system, known only to himself. He had retired nearly a decade ago, but still lived in a cramped flat above the old bank with his sister Edna and a cat named Goliath, who disliked everyone on principle. Miss Marple arrived just after 11. Edna offered her lukewarm tea and a scone so dry it might have been wartime ration, then disappeared into the back with a tray of seed for the pigeons. Trowbridge eyed Miss Marple over his spectacles. "You've come about the Teahouse business, haven't you?" "Among other things," she said mildly. He sighed. "I thought I was done with secrets." Miss Marple said nothing, only waited. Silence, she knew, was more effective than pressure. Finally, Trowbridge reached into a drawer and withdrew a small leather notebook. "I kept this," he muttered, "because I had a feeling, a solicitor's instinct." He handed it to her. Inside were dates, addresses, and a handful of notes. One caught her attention immediately. July 1946. Request to formalize property deed transfer from K. Feuerstein to L.C. Cotterill. Condition: destroy all Vienna. Correspondence: confidential. Miss Marple looked up. She was preparing to disappear, she said softly. Trowbridge nodded. "She came to me with shaking hands and an envelope thick with cash. Said she was being hunted. Wanted the house in her daughter's name. No trail, no inquiries. I never saw her again after that." "Do you remember what was in the correspondence she asked to destroy?" "Not specifically, but I glanced at one. It was from someone named Otto. Hostile tone. Something about betrayal. And something called the Winter List." Miss Marple blinked. "The Winter List?" "A list of informants compiled during the Nazi purge of Vienna's resistance network, rumored to have been leaked to the Gestapo in '38. Most on it died, but the source of the leak was never confirmed, so Carolina might have been blamed or blackmailed." Miss Marple thanked him, returned the notebook, and took her leave, her thoughts spinning. If Carolina had known of this list, perhaps even been forced to help compile it, it explained why she vanished and why someone might now want the truth kept buried. She returned to her cottage and wrote, "Missing photo equals proof of link to Winter List. Removed recently, possibly by Friedrich or another." Trowbridge saw letter from Otto. Aggressive. If Otto lived, could he be in Little Skelton now? The thought chilled her more than the rain on the windows. At 3:30, the vicar's niece, Alice, came hurrying down the lane again. "Miss Marple, there's someone asking about you. At the Grey Robin, foreign, coat to big, walks with a limp." Miss Marple rose at once. "Tell no one," she said quietly. "Not yet." The Grey Robin was quiet that afternoon, just a few pensioners playing dominoes and Mrs. Everdeen sipping sherry near the window. The man sat alone at the far corner, his hat lowered, coat damp from the drizzle. He looked older than the photograph, more worn, but unmistakably the same man, Friedrich. Miss Marple approached without hesitation. "May I sit?" He glanced up. His face, though lined, bore no hostility, only a tired sort of recognition. "I hoped it would be you," he said, voice low, accented. "You see things others don't." Miss Marple studied him. "You came back. I never left properly. Just long enough to be missed." "What are you looking for, Mr. Feuerstein?" He flinched at the name. "That name died in Vienna. I am Franz now. Friedrich was my brother." Miss Marple froze. Then, "Yes, I am Otto." There was silence. The dominoes clacked across the room. Outside, the rain thickened. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Did you kill him?" Otto looked away. "No, but I found him. In the Teahouse. Still warm. He died with the envelope in his hand. The one Carolina left." Why not come forward? I had no claim, no proof. Only a history no one wants told. And the photograph. He glanced at her. I took it. It showed all three of us. Me, her, and Friedrich, smiling in Lausanne. It was the only time she looked free. Miss Marple tilted her head. Why take it now? Because the past is heavy, he said, and some faces carry too much of it. He stood slowly, favoring his left side. I did not kill him, but someone wanted him dead. Someone who feared what he might find, do you? Otto met her eyes. I fear what I already know. Then he left, coat brushing past the doorframe. Footsteps fading into the rain. Miss Marple sat for a long while after. Otto, alive, watching, and perhaps not the villain history claimed. But if he wasn't the killer, then who was? She returned home and wrote, Otto equals alive. Not Friedrich. Removed photo. Knows more. Carolina's death still unclear. Who else stood to lose from truth? Who feared the winter list still held power? Then, beneath it, a single word, Lillian. She looked out at the teahouse, blurred by mist. The dead man had come seeking justice, but the living, it seemed, had far more to lose. Chapter 9. What Lillian never said. 1,000-word Shrine continued into Sunday. A soft, relentless mist that wrapped little Skelton in a kind of hushed reverence. Church bells rang hollow through the gray, and even the robins seemed to sing more quietly. It was not weather for gossip, nor for gardening, but it was perfect, Miss Marple thought. For reflection, she had barely touched her toast. The newspaper lay unopened. Instead, she stared out at the garden, brow gently furrowed, turning over the final conversation with Otto, if it truly was Otto. His words still clung to her. I fear what I already know, not fear of violence, not even exposure, but of something older, something buried. Miss Marple opened her notebook, now dense with ink and crossings out. She reviewed her notes again. Carolina equals K. Feuerstein, changed identity post-war, linked to winter list. Friedrich equals deceased, may have sought truth or redemption. Otto equals alive, claims innocence, removed photograph. Lillian equals vanished, but had knowledge, possible key. The list circled back always to Lillian. Everyone else had come looking for something. Friedrich, perhaps for forgiveness. Otto, for protection or perhaps truth. Eva, for remembrance. But Lillian? She had vanished, and yet left behind a room meticulously preserved, a photograph carefully framed, and a note, addressed to no one, full of guilt and warning. Miss Marple rose, fetched her mackintosh, and made her way to the vicarage. If there was one person in the village who might still hold a thread of Lillian's presence, it was Alice. Alice Weatherby answered the door in a faded dressing gown, cheeks pink with surprise. Oh, Miss Marple, come in. You'll catch your death out there. I think I've already caught a theory, Alice, Miss Marple said with a smile. They settled in the sitting room as the vicar puttered in the kitchen. Miss Marple waited until the sound of the kettle masked their conversation. You knew Lillian, didn't you? Not closely, but enough to remember her manner? Alice nodded. Quiet, not shy exactly, just self-contained. She never really seemed part of things. Did she ever speak of her mother? Only once. I remember because it was odd. I had complimented her on a scarf silk, patterned like ivy leaves. She said it belonged to a woman who never told the truth. Then she laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. I didn't know what to say. Miss Marple tapped her fingers on the armrest. What if, she said slowly, the truth was something Lillian couldn't accept? Alice tilted her head. Do you mean that her mother had lied to her? Perhaps, or perhaps Lillian chose not to know. Some lies, once uncovered, leave you lonelier than when you believed them. Alice frowned. Do you think she's still alive? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where rain smeared the panes like tears on glass. I think she may have been hiding long before she disappeared. She rose then, thanked Alice, and walked directly to the old Teahouse. The police tape flapped weakly in the breeze, its authority thinned by time and damp. Miss Marple stepped through the gate and around the back. The garden, though overgrown, still bore the shape of care ivy trimmed once with intention. A rusted trellis that had known roses. She went straight to the cellar door. It had been overlooked in earlier searches. She remembered it now, barely visible beneath the creeper vine. With effort, she pried it open. Inside, stairs descending into cold shadow. She lit her small torch and stepped down. It was a modest root cellar, stone-walled, lined with empty shelves. But in the corner, beneath a moth-eaten tarpaulin, she found a wooden crate. And inside, letters. Hundreds of them, all addressed to Lillian Cotterill. Return address, Zurich, Lausanne, London. All signed with a simple F. Miss Marple took the top one and opened it. Lillian, I write not to accuse, but to understand. She loved you. Whatever she did to protect you. But you must know that silence has a cost. I never blamed you. I never will. But the truth is coming soon, and I pray you can face it. Miss Marple read 3 more. Each was gentler than the last. Regret poured out in every line. Friedrich had not come for vengeance. He had come for reconciliation. And Lillian had known it. Miss Marple examined the crate again. Beneath the letters was a smaller box, metal, locked. She lifted it. It was surprisingly heavy. It was the kind of box, she thought, one might leave behind if the weight of its contents had grown unbearable. She took it to Sergeant Braithwaite that evening. The contents, once unlocked, were simple, a list of names. Dozens. Hundreds. Next to some, red marks. Many had footnotes. Some were British. Some were Austrian. All had one thing in common: they had been on the winter list. But beside one, at the very bottom, was an annotation in careful script. K. Feuerstein, under duress. Acted to protect child. Should not be held responsible. It was Friedrich's handwriting. Miss Marple looked up at the sergeant. She wasn't the traitor, she said. She was the scapegoat, and he came here to exonerate her. But someone didn't want that known. Braithwaite murmured. Miss Marple nodded. Someone who feared the truth more than the consequences of murder. She looked back down at the list. And there, tucked among the names, was one more, not circled, not marked. Just listed. Eva Muller. Miss Marple's heart slowed. Not as a friend. As an informant. Chapter 10. The truth beneath the ivy. The drizzle had stopped, and the village of Little Skelton sat once more beneath a pale sky, its rooftops steaming gently in the sunlight. The Teahouse, wrapped in ivy and history, seemed unchanged, but inside, something had shifted. The past, long buried beneath whispers and polite forgettings, had finally surfaced. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage promptly at 4 o'clock, as arranged. Reverend Biddle poured the tea, and Sergeant Braithwaite stood stiffly by the hearth. Eva Muller, composed as ever in her navy blue coat, sat opposite Miss Marple with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. You said you had something to show me, Eva said. Miss Marple placed a small folder on the table. It's a list, she said simply, recovered from the Teahouse cellar. Letters, names, the winter list. Ava's expression did not change. I've heard of it. Then you'll understand the significance, Miss Marple continued. One name stood out to me, yours. A pause. Eva glanced at the folder, but did not touch it. I was very young, she said at last. Just a girl with a good memory. I typed what I was told, and perhaps passed it along, Miss Marple said gently. Perhaps not to the Gestapo, but to others. British intelligence, perhaps. You survived. That's clear. Ava's smile was faint now. And survival is a crime? No, Miss Marple said, but covering the truth with blood is. Ava's eyes darkened. You think I killed him? I think Friedrich came here not to expose Carolina but to clear her name. He had no reason to confront you publicly. But you didn't know that, did you? You thought he carried proof of your involvement. And if your past emerged your position now, your reputation would be gone. Eva said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the teacup. The photograph you removed, Miss Marple said softly. It showed you, didn't it? Not Otto, not another brother. You were the third figure, the girl Carolina once mentored, the one who remembered too much. Ava's hand trembled now. I loved her, she whispered. But I was weak. I gave the names they wanted. They told me she had already betrayed us. I believed them. And when I learned the truth when Friedrich began to dig, I couldn't bear it. I couldn't let him ruin what I rebuilt. Sergeant Braithwaite stepped forward. But Miss Marple raised a hand. There's more, she said. Carolina's death, sudden, unexplained. Ava's breath caught. She was going to write to Zurich, to tell them Lillian was innocent, to tell them you were not. So you came one evening, quietly, no fuss, a small bottle in your pocket. Eva closed her eyes. She said she forgave me, she murmured. She looked at me like I was still a child. Miss Marple's voice was calm. And you killed her. The silence was complete. Even the vicar seemed unsure whether to speak. Eva opened her eyes. I did what I had to do, no. Miss Marple said, rising. You did what you feared. And now Friedrich lies in the teahouse where he came to make peace. Sergeant Braithwaite stepped forward and gently took Ava's arm. She did not resist. Later, Miss Marple walked the lane alone. The air smelled of damp grass and old secrets. The teahouse stood quiet now, but lighter, somehow less burdened. The truth had not come easily. It never did. She paused at the garden gate, looking once more at the ivy-clad stone. Lillian Cotterill was never found. Perhaps she never wished to be. But Miss Marple had no doubt that somewhere she lived with the knowledge that her mother had died not as a traitor, but as a protector, that Friedrich had forgiven her, and that, at last, someone had spoken the truth aloud. Back home, she set down her teacup and returned to her notebook. One final entry, Eva Muller, child informant turned witness. Carolina, never the betrayer. Friedrich, died seeking absolution. Otto, misjudged. Lillian, still a silence, but no longer a stain. Justice, quiet, but whole. Miss Marple closed the book. Outside, the village settled into dusk. Another case, closed not with a gavel, but with a teacup and a name restored.